Hello chess fans, I'm Sam Copeland, a national master on the content team here at Chess.com, and I'm here today to show you another incredible computer chess win, this one by Komodo as black against Rofchade. In this game, we are going to see Komodo use the Schara-Hennig Gambit, a gambit that is usually considered a little bit suspect, a little bit dubious, but in Komodo's hands, it's going to look crushing. The game opens with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, and c5, the Schara-Hennig Gambit. Now, this probably isn't the best gambit, but there are probably some of you out there who just want some activity, and this gambit grants that. Certainly after seeing this game, I'm inspired to try it out. Now, here we see pawn takes d5, pawn takes d4, and of course, white can capture on d4 right away, but why not be stylish? Queen a4 check first. Now bishop d7, queen takes d4, pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, and knight to f6. Black's point is of course rapid mobilization of the minor pieces, creating quick threats and hopefully catching white out. White needs some time to castle and to develop the minor pieces. If white does not play carefully, maybe black will win beautifully. Now, the normal human opening theory here is just queen to d1. It may seem cowardly to pull the queen all the way back to her starting square, but this is a pretty good square for the queen and she's relatively safe here. In this case, it is hard for black to get enough counterplay. However, in the game, Rofchade plays the greedy computer move, queen takes b7, winning a second pawn but losing a lot more time. Of course, the pawns on b7 and on b2 are known as poison pawns, and generally it's not recommended to capture them because you lose so much time. This game is a perfect demonstration of that point. After queen takes b7, we see knight to c6, and anticipating rook to b8, white goes ahead and plays queen back to b3. Rook to b8 anyway, and the queen still makes it to d1. White does have two pawns instead of one now, but no additional development. Now, after bishop to b4, black is starting to make real threats. Knight to e4, queen to a5, and of course, just castling and including this rook on the d file. As white, I think a human would be terrified. Now we see pawn to e3, knight to e4, threatening to capture here on c3, so the queen moves yet again. There have been so many tempo devoted to moving this queen. Knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, and this is the first of many beautiful moves from Komodo, where Komodo is going to continue to bring the minor pieces forward to make threats, seeming to put them on pre, but it's never possible for white to capture them. Bishop to f5. The bishop is of course not defended, but after queen takes f5, then you win material with bishop takes c3, and the rook on a1 falls. So after bishop f5, we see pawn to e4. Now both bishops are being attacked by pawns. Queen to e7, pinning this pawn here. Now, interestingly, it is possible to capture here on b4. And as a human, what I would instinctively consider is bishop takes e4. This attacks the queen, it defends c6, and it threatens bishop takes g2. But now white has a computer defense, queen to c5. No other move is actually good, but this move wins for white. White is now up a clean piece. However, after c takes b4, knight takes b4 is good. There are still the threats of bishop takes on e4 or queen takes on e4, and the knight is threatening all kinds of things. As it turns out, according to the engine, this is a decisive attack. So after queen e7, what we actually see is bishop to d3. Finally, some development of the minor pieces. The first developing move of a minor piece since the third move. So after bishop d3, again, we see a forward move seeming to place a minor piece on prise, but it's not possible to capture it. Knight to b4, d4 I mean. This is a very, very visual and beautiful move. Of course, the queen is under attack here, and you cannot capture the knight because of the pin, so the queen must move. Queen to d2, and now bishop takes on e4. The threats of bishop takes d3 and bishop takes g2 do not leave a lot of choice to white, so we see king to f1, moving the king off of the deadly e file. Now, rook to d8. I love this move. There are many moves I love in this game, but I really like this move. Again, all of these pieces seem to be on prise, and it's never possible to capture them. The rook was no longer doing anything on b8, but it can do a lot on d8. In this position, you cannot capture the bishop on b4 because of the pretty move knight to c2. attacking the rook here on a1 and unloading on the now pinned bishop on d3. Of course, queen captures knight, runs into bishop takes d3 with a fork that wins the white queen. So after rook d8, we see bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, and in this position, pawn to f3, attacking the queen on e4 and finally gaining a little room for the white king to move. Now we see queen back to e6, and in this position, white is finally able to win a piece. Komodo has turned this into a true minor piece sacrifice. We see pawn takes b4, and now queen c4 check. In this position, you cannot play knight to e2 because after knight c2, there is an attack on the queen and on the rook here on a1. As a result, black wins material. Notice that the knight on c2 is perfectly attacking the rook and covering queen to e3 check, so the queen has no good square to move out of the check. So after queen c4, we see the king move up to f2, knight c2 anyway, attacking the queen and attacking the rook. It looks like this might just be over, but white does have a good move. Queen to g5. It turns out there's no time to capture the rook. If knight takes a1, queen takes g7. Now, probably you can find an example, but I cannot recall ever having seen a position where there is a fork of two pieces in the opposite corners of the board. In this case, white actually wins. After rook f8, then queen takes a1, picks off the knight, and defends the bishop on c1. There's knight to e2 coming, and there's just no way for black to keep the initiative. In fact, it's finally his king that is in trouble. So after queen g5, we actually see castles. I always love seeing castling, and this move, of course, just nullifies all of white's threats and creates a lot of threats for black in this position. So now the rook is finally under attack. It needs to move rook to b1, and in this position, I highly encourage you to pause your video and try to find the imaginative move that Komodo played. Well, that decisive move is knight to e1. Moving forward yet again with a minor piece, seeming to place this minor piece on prise and winning the game. The first point here is that the knight cannot be captured because the knight sacrifice is actually a clearance sacrifice, allowing the queen to access the c2 square that the knight was on. Now there is a threat to capture the rook and to play rook to d1 with mate in 1. However, even if you don't capture this knight on e1, there is still the idea of queen to c2. The queen really needed the square that the knight was on. There are also other ideas. For example, invasion by the rook here, and also going after the g2 square in some cases. We'll see some examples. In this position, the threat of queen to c2 allows white only a few defenses. One, for example, is king to g3, moving the king so that queen to c2 will no longer be check. Now strong here is queen to f1, sliding the queen also into the opposite rank, threatening queen takes g2 here. Now king h3 allows the queen on g5 to defend here. Rook to d1. I love this position so much. Black has placed 3 pieces on the opposite rank here, totally split the white forces, pinned the knight, and pinned the bishop here. There are also threats in this position, play knight to d3 and go after this bishop and also go after the f2 square. In this position, there's not a lot white can do. So if you try bishop to b2, which actually creates a mate threat, there is now pawn to f6, bishop takes f6, rook takes f6, and even though the rook is hanging on d1, after rook h6, eventually the queen is going to have to give herself up for the rook on h6 or on f6. For example, king g4, queen takes g2, and now after king f4, rook to f6. Ultimately, also, when white gives up the queen for the rook, this rook is still trapped in the corner, so black is going to win on material. In the game, after knight to e1, what we actually saw was knight to e2, developing another minor piece and blocking this check here so that queen c2 does not win. Now we see knight back to d3 check. That knight was actually finally under attack by this rook, and king to g3. The king is forced up the board. Of course, it is not safe and happy to be here, but there is no better choice. Now, after the king slides up to g3, we see queen c2, forking the rook and the knight and winning back material. After winning the knight on e2, black is only going to be down a pawn, and what's really going to matter is the attack. The king is too exposed in front of the pawns on g3, and that is going to lead to a decisive attack for black. So rook to b3, queen takes e2, queen to e3, begging for a queen trade, queen to c2, queen to d2, begging for a queen trade again. Now, an aggressive move that's very natural for humans, I think, is queen c7, and then f4 and g5, and this is probably decisive. But Komodo goes for something a little more subtle and positional, simply queen to c6. Now, after queen c6, you cannot capture the knight on d3 because after rook takes d3, there is queen to g6 with a fork, and you win the rook on d3 and you win on material. So after queen c6, we see pawn to h3. The knight is perfectly placed, stopping the king from falling back behind his pawns with king f2. So h3 is trying to allow the king to escape in this direction instead. Now, a beautiful move, rook to d4. The point of rook to d4 is to stop the defense pawn to f4 in a moment. So after rook f1, queen c7, pawn to f4, you now have knight takes f4 with 2 points. The first point is that the queen cannot capture on f4 without giving herself up for the rook. The other point is that there is the beautiful royal fork and double check here after queen takes d4, knight to e2 check, and this wins the game. In the game, white does actually surrender the queen. There is no better choice after this beautiful knight takes f4 move. Queen takes f4, and now rook takes, bishop takes. In this position, black has a queen for a bishop and a rook. The pawns are equal. Given that there is some discoordination in the white camp, this is going to be enough to win the game. Black is able to simply pick off the pawns on the queen side here by mobilizing the rook and the queen, creating a number of threats, and eventually as the a pawn goes and then the b pawn goes thereafter, black is going to start getting the a pawn down the board, and that's going to force material concessions for white. In the Computer Chess Championship, the engines play out to mate in all cases, so we do see this game go out as far as move 81, but the result is never really in doubt. It's just black playing very, very cleanly to convert this position. I'll play it out till mate, but as we see the mate play out, I'll simply say that I hope you've enjoyed this game. I think it's a very instructive example of gambit play. It's an instructive example of why you don't want to capture a poisoned pawn on b7. And if you want to see more of these great computer chess games, I highly encourage you to check out the playlist that is popping up on your screen right now, along with this checkmate.